Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Kelly Dukes, Education Community Organizer for the Urban League Center for Social Justice. Thank you for coming with us today. We're going to be speaking with Eddie Koen and Bruce Jeffries about a very important topic, education equity, especially within the Black community and in the region. So I'm going to give them opportunity to introduce themselves, and we'll jump right into the broadcast.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you, Kelly, for the invite tonight. So my name is Bruce Jeffery. I'm with Cradle to Career Cincinnati, also Vice President of Community Action with the YMCA of Greater Cincinnati. Actually moved here in August, so I was one who ventured out during the pandemic for this wonderful opportunity to lead a collective impact in our Cincinnati region. Before Cincinnati, I was in Louisville, Kentucky with the YMCA helping open a new facility. And then before then, I spent 12 years with the Boys and Girls Club as CEO and in operations. And so my whole career has really been around this idea: how do we not only be champions for our kids who need us the most, but how do we work collectively as a community and provide our youth and families with better opportunities to grow up to become productive, caring, and responsible citizens. And so happy to be here in the region. Can't believe it's going to be a year almost.
That's right. Wow.
So
crazy, right?
I'm not sure where the last year went, but it's been a great one to be able to build some relationships. But I definitely would say as we look at the future of education in our city, I definitely feel like there are some opportunities not only to be innovative, but how do we ensure that parent and family voice is part of where we go moving forward. So thanks again, Kelly, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you.
Yep. And so I'm Eddie Koen, President and CEO of Urban League of Greater Southwestern Ohio. I've been in this post for about a year and 10 months, almost 2 years now. Moved here from Denver, Colorado, where I held a post as Chief Impact Officer at United Way, but I actually have a pretty interesting background in education. So I was chief of staff of Denver Public Schools, which is the largest public school district in Colorado, has 90,000 students, 15,000 employees. So I manage, over $1 billion budget, their lobbying functions, some of the superintendent's direct reports, the legal team, you name it. And I was an advisor for Lumina Foundation, which is based out of Indiana, which is all about higher access and racial equity as it comes to attainment and matriculation into college. So this is the foundation that was behind a lot of states setting a goal for what portion of the adult population they wanted to attain degrees or credentials. They do a lot of great work. That was through HCM Strategist and Lumina. And then I ran a nonprofit called College Track, which is a regional-based nonprofit. Most of our sites are in California, but we take kids from 8th grade all the way through college completion. So it's a 2 and through program, which is awesome. So we're in DC, Louisiana, Colorado, and California right now. So just happy to be here to talk about education. I think everyone on this call is really passionate about education equity and change. So thanks for having us here.
Great. Thank you guys for being here. Let's just jump right in. So historically, what has the data told us about education of Black children?
I'll go ahead and start, Eddie, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I think here for Cincinnati and maybe all across the country, the data has shown maybe what some of us have already known, that unfortunately our Black and minority students are not entering certain or meeting certain milestones when we look at the Cradle to Career continuum, right? So if we look at the entire continuum of Cradle to Career, we know that there are critical milestones: kindergarten readiness, 3rd grade reading, 8th grade math, high school graduation, and then post-secondary attainment. And so the data shows us here in Cincinnati that when we look at kindergarten readiness, the current baseline for our Black and minority students are only 32%, high school graduation, 79%, post-secondary is 52%, and then credential attainment is 20%. Now, if you look at the data and research across the entire region, and I would say you look at the A-rated districts, then those districts in those particular areas, they are achieving kindergarten readiness at 84%, high school graduation at 97%, post-secondary enrollment at 85%, and then credential attainment at 65%. And so the data is very clear that unfortunately our Black and minority students are not achieving these critical transition points. And so I think as we come outside and hopefully look at education through a new lens, that it's not necessarily about closing achievement gaps, but looking at how do we ensure that ecosystems are equitable across the board for our entire Cincinnati region.
Yeah, and I would add, if you look at the rates of attainment, and what we mean by attainment is that folks who have finished high school and had some form of credential is equally low, right? Depending on how folks define it, some say first generation students about a 20% attainment rate. The highest across the country, right? It's like a 30-something% rate for Black students coming out of most public school districts, right? When you combine them in the aggregate. So we're generally just doing bad, one, just to get a pipeline of folks to college, right? I'm not saying that college is the only place where folks can matriculate to, but to matriculate to college and complete, you look at that year one data of the number of students that persist from year one to year two. We've got a lot of work to do. I mean, and we know all the data, right, around poverty is still the highest rate, so the second highest rate for Black students if you don't count, natives. A lack of internet access has been just incredible, especially through the pandemic. More Black students with disabilities receive complaints about disturbances. One of the projects that I was most proud of when I was chief of staff was that we passed a resolution, the board passed the resolutions to end expulsions and suspensions from kindergarten to third grade in different schools, because we saw, and you might have to correct me on the data, but it was something like Black students were 5 times more likely to get expelled and suspended from schools than their white counterparts. Now, we don't have a monopoly on disruptive behavior, you know what I mean? And even proportionately, I think, the Black students were, it was majority Latino, but it wasn't even the majority of students in the district. But this disproportionality, I mean, either it's just like real in the sandbox and we don't know it, or we have a problem with bias and how people perceive our students. And we know this just from being disproportionately labeled as needing special ed students or having to be diagnosed with ADHD. Those systemic things have really hit our systems in ways, not just over the past 10 years, but over the past 50 years. One of the things that's frustrating to me, Kelly, I came from a district that was a portfolio district. So the argument there was around, charter versus district schools, innovation versus non-innovation schools. And it's like, we have been fighting for reform as Black people before charters even existed. You know what I mean? If you look, there's a great book that I recommend to people called The Teacher Wars that really covers the teaching profession and movement from, Black teacher unions versus the main unions versus the Black Power movement and the public education movement, of just like how these things happen over and over again.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so I think, Eddie, to add a little bit on that, coming from, being a former foster care kid, growing up in St. Louis and looking at, some of the public school systems that I understand better now, but then, back then I really didn't understand growing up in the, 80s and 90s, is that, even as we look at our Black and minority students, graduating, the question that we have to ask ourselves, are the systems set up to meet the needs of all the students, or are the systems set up for those students who, already may have that structural support, that back support? And so I think that's a big question that we have to look at as we continue to evolve. And what I say, take a new approach to education is are our systems set up for kids now, or were our systems set up for what kids were like, 50 years ago, in regards to understanding that, I do believe we have to take the holistic approach, even with college students, right? We know, although a kid may be 18 and out of high school, that there are still some important wraparound services and supports that, can help guide our young people as they do pursue, their higher education or their, degree of, credential attainment. How do we, as, employers across our region, look to provide those additional wraparound services, not just because them being young, but because we are invested in, wanting them to be a part of our organizations and companies.
You guys both actually bring up, I'm sorry, Eddie, you all both actually bring up some really good points. I was going to say, and Bruce, it's interesting that you would say, is the system set up for kids who only have that structural support? Actually attended a Racial Equity Matters seminar last week, and they saw that even African-American students whose parents are in a tax bracket of $60,000 or more are still achieving at a lower rate than white students who are 2 tax brackets below them. So that would say that that's a systematic issue, not even a class issue. So,
yeah. And the good news is, always, just because there's so much dominant narrative about underachievement in Black communities, I do always point out the positive side, of just like how our individual biases. I remember moving to Cincinnati, and I was instructed, almost 98% of the people who I spoke with said, get your kid in school, give them a pathway to Walnut Hills in Cincinnati, right? And here are the primary schools that you look at. You can look at School of Performing Arts. You can look at North Avondale. You can look at Kilgore, Hyde Park, right? And then some other ones that were far out, right? But these were, with the exception of maybe North Avondale, majority schools. And the interesting thing is, when I did my own research, the highest performing school in CPS is Evanston, a Black school that's 96% Black. Right? The principal is excellent, right? Some of the interesting research we found when I was at Denver Public Schools is that parents actually make choices based off of the other parents that attend schools versus the actual academic outcomes. They're more likely to be persuaded by what other parents and kids go there versus how they actually achieve. And that points to a bigger systemic issue around racism. I like to say social determinants of education. We understand that when we say social determinants of health, but there are certainly, I think, what Brother Bruce was talking about, social determinants of education. When we think about redlining, school funding as it's tied to property taxes, the concentration of wealth, lack of affordable housing, school to prison pipeline. These are not inherent to Black students' ability, but their access and the systems that we put them in place it is more difficult. How do we reconcile all of this? And then on the other side of it, Black women are the highest, fastest growing college attendees in the country. More than Asian men, more than white men. They are growing faster and attaining more degrees than white men and Asian men, white women, Asian women in the country, right? Despite all of that. So the bright side of it is, if we can just get some type of parity, we really would knock it out of the park, because our kids are brilliant. They just need to have the tools and the resources in front of them, and that some of our more affluent districts have.
True. Just to touch really quick again on the disparities, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the disparities that we've seen in education?
So I'll go ahead and jump in. I think, for some of us that's been in the work, and that's been in what I call been fighting the good fight for years, I think it only highlighted what has already existed, which is the systems are not set up cohesively for all of our kids to be successful, right? So, I mean, we could talk about the technology. I was in Louisville when the pandemic first hit. So Louisville has the 17th largest school district in the country. They got 97,000 students, right? So the pandemic hit in March of 2020. I ended up transitioning in August. So right as they were planning to go back in school, and just in West Louisville, which West Louisville was a population of 90,000, there were 5,000 kids who did not have access to technology just in West Louisville. Now, that doesn't count the rest of Jefferson County as a whole that make up those 97,000 students in the entire population. And so I could only imagine, as we look at a broader landscape across the country on how the pandemic hit and our communities, how it just, again, we knew some of this was here, but how it elevated it more than what we ever probably could imagine.
Yeah, essentially anything that was bad or questionable or needed improvement in our system was exacerbated, right?
Yeah.
Post-COVID, I mean, Bruce hit on tech equity. Like many students were who went to school virtually dropped off the map completely.
Off.
Right.
Completely
like,
off the map. And consider this, Kelly. Yeah, it's
Right.
before the pandemic, only 1 out of 5 Black families had the ability to work from home. So, it was really annoying, but I understood it was good intent to really refer to folks who had no economic choice as sort of our essential workers and heroes, right? And I remember talking to a cousin who's an essential worker, and I don't want to work. I have to, right? I want to be at home and to homeschool my kid, and I have no choice, right? So many folks just didn't have the luxury of being home to supervise their kids, because they were considered essential workers. And then we cannot underestimate the loss of income and housing security. If you look at the city of Cincinnati from 1999 to 2017, all of the suburbs we have, with the exception of 2, has increased in poverty. So what we're saying is that poverty is mobile, and in some cities it's as high as 10%. That was before the pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a lot of housing insecurities, and students having to completely start over, new districts, from families that are already living paycheck to paycheck or below the poverty line, and so everything from couch surfing to making sure they have access to stable internet. So with no place to study or do homework and stable environment, education suffers. And we even saw, Kelly and Bruce, was that in virtual settings, there's like studies that came out about this around Black children being disproportionately disciplined or suspended.
Right, in a virtual setting.
Yeah, in a virtual setting, right? And we're all figuring that stuff out. So it just laid bare what we already knew, right? From, I can't tell you, even in some of our outreach work, we won't name the schools, but one school reached out to us, said, hey, half the parents hadn't picked up the laptop. We have the information, we have it correct, right, of how to contact them. And then, a third party like the Urban League ended up connecting with some of those parents. And they're like, no, I didn't get any message. Right. I've been working all day. I hadn't heard from the school. Right. And it's just like, oh, my gosh, you've missed weeks and weeks. Mm-hmm. Right. We're going to have to recover from the pandemic a long time from now, because we always talk about the summer slide and learning loss when students aren't active over the summer. But students have grappled with this for an entire year now. Right. Mm-hmm. And then you look at a lot of the affluent schools, which were back in August.
I mean, they were right back.
We're back in August. And I'm not saying that was the right thing to do, or that hybrid was the right role of being out. But it's just, we know, from food security, from just frustrations at home to parents who had to work, there's going to be a lot of recovery from the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Eddie, I would take an opportunity, and I think would be remiss if we didn't try to, at some point in time of the pandemic, I can't say specifically when, because again, I was in transitioning from two different cities. But I think once we did try to get an idea, if you look at the organizations who really rallied around, how do we get food into our communities? Yeah. How do we get food? I know coming from Illinois, I even followed the school district. I know they was doing deliveries to homes. That school district only had 9,000 students, so that may be a little bit more practical unlike Cincinnati, where we got 35,000 students in our public system. But to see organizations at some point in time of the pandemic try to rally this cohesive idea of how do we take care of our community at a whole. And I think, to this conversation and to just our efforts in general, that's really the idea is how do we look at our systems? How do we identify those systems that are broken, but predominantly have been impacting our Black and minority families, and not just try to find quick fixes, but ultimately try to put things in place that it is cohesive across the board, right? So Lord forbid a pandemic hit next year, right? If all of the affluent school districts are going to school in August, then all of our students are going back to school in August, right? And so again, it's making sure that there's equity across the board for our kids around education.
That's great, because that actually goes into my next question. For each of you, if you could just kind of define what is educational equity in your opinion. I know for me personally, educational equity is no matter what school you're at, public, private, charter, you're all going to receive a quality education. Now, I would expect at a private school, there would be some differences because your family is actually paying for that education. But that overall, no matter what building you go into, you're still going to receive a quality education. And I'm also looking at education as a fundamental civil right as well. So Eddie, Bruce, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so Eddie, I don't know if you want to start, but
go ahead.
Go ahead. So, over the pandemic, we've really identified kind of this idea when you think about place-based models is how do we have and create customized youth development experiences, right? So when we look at education, too many times it's been one size fit none. But how do we truly look at the individual needs of our students and ensure that each student has the wraparound services and support that best fits their educational need, right? And so if I had to think of systems being equitable, it's about us having policies, procedures, opportunities in place. So as we identify and create relationships with families and these individual students, then we can truly customize their educational experience that best fits them, right? So, if little Johnny needs A, B, and C, and Sally doesn't need A and B, then we've identified that, and little Johnny is getting A, B, and C, but Sally is, only getting C because that's her customized experience. And so I think it's taking a deeper look, building relationships with family and inviting families to co-create what this customized youth development experience, because the family structure is a critical piece, but we also know that the school is a critical piece of that experience for our young people.
Yes, very much.
Yeah, I think of education, I just would co-sign. When you think about educational equity, there's like different theories, and when you work with districts and organizations, they are frequently like at this continuum, right? So like one continuum is like all children need books, right? They need access to books. People can understand that, right? Of just everyone in kindergarten should have access to books, book library, that's the easy stuff. When you flip to the end of that continuum, it's the racial equity lens, right? Which is about dismantling the racial and structural inequities that hold unrepresented minorities back. And when I say minorities, I mean those that are not a part of the majority culture. So this could apply to rural students as well, right? Mm-hmm. They're left out because they're not a part of that majority ethos, right? People think about, I think, racial equity or just DEI in general, right, in education in like 4 buckets. Like the first is like equity by proxy. This is the most common one we hear. How many free and reduced lunch students?
Right.
Like, why is that relevant when I'm looking up a school?
Right.
To find out what the percentage of free and reduced lunch students are, right? That has nothing to do with selecting a school, right? And we use proxies like that to really substitute for race. We use things like lower income, right? And some of it is legal parameters, I get it. But other things you hear about at risk or high return students.
Single parent households.
Right.
Right.
Mobility,
Charity.
transit students.
Right. Charity, community service. So that's like the equity by proxy group, right? Then you have the people and place-based equity. That's kind of like collective impact. Nothing wrong with this. It focuses on vulnerable sections of our community, underserved communities, right? Then you have this this racial justice lens that we talked about. That's all about dismantling racial and structural inequities. And then even the emerging stuff that's been popular over the last, I would say, like 7 to 8 years is all about belonging and collectiveness and targeted universalism, things like that. It's appealing to the desire of everyone to belong and aligning investments to aspiration and co-building a vision. So if you look at any educational institution, they're usually somewhere in that continuum. But it's really institutions, it's tangible things, and it's relational. That's what equity is when it relates to schools. Of what are the opportunity structures within institutions? Do I have quality schools? Do we live by a hospital? Do we have economic development that we can tax and feed into our systems that's institutional? Do we have tangible things like access to transportation, healthy food, clean parks around us, and the relational piece? Can I call the principal, Bruce, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say, this is what I'm pissed off about at my school, and you need to change it. Walnut Hills, you know what I'm saying? Like, do you have those relational and that personal privilege where you can advocate for your school, things that won't be done with folks that have less social power? So that's the cultural relevance and the information networks. And it plays out like in those 3 buckets, intertwined with race, ability, nationality, sexual orientation, et cetera. So the short answer is complicated, but it's like if we really target what we want to build, we can actually move the racial equity argument in education.
Yeah, and Eddie, just to add a little bit to that, I think that's where it has to, at some point in time, shift from a top-down approach to I'm not even going to say bottom, because parents belong
on the top,
are a key part of that, but it can't be doing for, it's going to have to be doing with, right? So the ideas, the concepts, the structures, if we don't truly get serious about how do we engage families to co-create this with us, then I think it'll continually to be the system doing for what they think is best for kids.
Yeah, and not to get off too much here, Kelly, but it's just like history is powerful. When we look at even if you said, I hate the idea of charter schools or the idea of sort of behavioral sit and get, a lot of this stuff was commodified through Black excellence. You look at KIPP Network, it was started by Harriet Ball, a Black teacher in Texas. Yeah. And who was studied essentially, and they programatized her methods and created a network. If you look at the popular sort of walk through hallways still, people say, oh, that's like a prison. No, it wasn't. It was a school called M School in Washington, D.C. That was an all Black school in like 1890, right? That outperformed all of the white schools in Washington, D.C., right? So it's like, like a lot of the models that we say, this is not us, they don't know our kids. It's like, no, if you dig deeper and you see where the research came from, it was from Black educators who've been in schools for 20 and 30 years, right? That someone really bottled up and commodified and tried and try to make a school out of it. So it's like we have the solutions to our own questions, right? Yes. If you really want to walk out, if you look at the data and segregation times when we had schools that were Black schools, you will see a disturbing trend that they were more high performing in many cases, and not an insubstantial amount. They were higher performing than our white counterparts, right? Back then. So it's like, so what is it? Why do you have an Evanston that's 96% Black and they have more challenges as a body politic? How are they growing faster? How are they a blue ribbon school? How are they performing higher on the state report card. It's like, because we have our own solutions, right? We just have to, when we think about organizations that massively invest in education, everyone is reimagining this, what this idea of racial equity in education looks like, because there's never been a massive investment in Black folks who are already experts in their own communities.
Right.
Mhm.
There's been some piecemeal things that have happened in Newark, where Zuckerberg gave a bunch of money to the city, but there hasn't been a systemic investment. And what we're seeing that change now. There's a lot of awesome startups, where folks are opening on schools and education and different types of pipelines. So I'm optimistic, even though we have a lot of challenges.
Great. There's a really good book called The Prize about Zuckerberg and what happened in Newark. I suggest that everyone read it.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, speaking about education advocacy, I know that both of you touched on, what we need to do within our community. How can parents advocate for change within education?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kelly. I guess since Eddie letting me kick off all the responses, I'll go ahead and kick it off. But, one thing that we are currently working with CPS around this kindergarten readiness strategy, which is really first grade reading, right? How do we ensure that kids are reading by first grade? The first bullet point is, the parent being the first teacher. And so I think that goes back to this age-old, how do we truly have parental involvement? And I'm not just talking about surveying parents to death or, inviting them to a meeting and getting input and never hearing from them again and putting out a report saying, this is our parental involvement. But, how do we ensure that the parent is the first teacher of our students, and I'll say it again and I'll keep saying it, but how do we co-create each kid's customized youth development experience with the parent, right? And so if I'm a parent, and I don't have any children just as of yet, but I'm sure there'll be some coming in the near future. But if I'm a parent dropping my kid off for first grade, right, is the teacher saying, hey, Mr. Jeffery, let's sit down and let me share with you and let's co-create what the work plan looked like to make sure that your kid leaves first grade as a reader? Or am I dropping my kid off and saying, all right, see you at the end of the school year. I'm not sure what you're going to learn or how you're going to be a reader, but my expectation is that you can read by the end of first grade. And so it's empowering our parents to be part of that process. But I think more of that, helping them to understand the system of education more. I tend to watch a lot of our local board meetings, and I'll be honest, I've been in 3 different states in the last 2 years, 3 different school districts, all the way from 9,000 to 97,000. And I feel like I have a good understanding of systems, processes, organizations, but just some educational language is kind of over my head. So I can't imagine a parent going into the classroom and you start talking about these ways that there are evaluation tools and the way that they do these, how does that relate to an everyday parent? And so, I think there's an opportunity as we hopefully look to be a little bit more innovative of what education looks like moving forward for our young people, is co-creating some of these ideas and strategies and ensuring that the parent or guardian is the first teacher. But more importantly, how do we translate what education look like to help everybody understand it in general? And so I think that if we can do that, that then will empower parents to want to have that, active engagement, that active participation, but more importantly, have a great understand that along this continuum, every milestone, I have a full grasp of what role I can play in supporting the school district in helping my kid reach these critical, milestones all the way to graduation and to college.
And just to piggyback off of that, Bruce, also, I think as we reimagine education, also meeting parents where they're at and even redefining what parental involvement looks like.
Mm-hmm.
That we know that, parents are working, parents have other children. So if it is an opportunity for, maybe parent-teacher conferences are all day long. So parents are able to kind of pop in when they're able to. Or maybe that parental involvement is just, that parent always makes sure that there's snacks available for the classroom. They might not be able to attend like a Zoom meeting, right? So also looking at different ways to measure parental involvement. Eddie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from someone who worked on the side of managing the political process in the school district, and to see the families who got a response versus the ones who are not effective in getting a response. It's like, I know this sounds like really basic, but it's like well, first of all, we have to understand like the social situatedness of parents who have the capital and the luxury of time, right? So first we got to know that parents are situated different. Like some have time to go to a school board meeting and some don't. And even, it's interesting because I have 3 kids in various stages. One's college, one's in kindergarten, one's, in preschool essentially. And just to navigate it is frustrating, even as someone who is experienced in navigating different systems. So one is just like gathering the right information, keeping records. The people who we responded to were the ones who showed up, who emailed us, right? If need to, going to the press, you know what I mean, and creating buzz. It's amazing. There's a group, and you might know the name of the group, Kelly. That is it's called Parent Empowerment Cincinnati Parent Empowerment Network.
Yeah, CPN.
Mm-hmm.
Probably one of the most powerful groups here, right now, because parents have the only unimpeachable voice, right? And I mean, that group has grown. I remember they had like 1,000 followers. I think there are like 14,000 in their group. I mean, it just incredible information sharing that they do. And superintendents and principals respond to folks who, one, they feel like will have influence. 2, who knows their stuff. Doesn't have to be perfectly articulated, as you said this, right? And I'm not going to let this go until you do it. And everybody has a boss, right? That's the beauty about it. If the principal ain't listening to you, they got to answer to a area instructional attendant. If that person's not listening to you, they got to deal with the chief academic officer. Chief academic officers listen to the principal. Principals listen to the board, and the board just don't want you to dislike them, right? But it's working in tandem with those folks, Kelly, to say, here's the nexus of power between your school, right, and your student. Because at the end of the day, you're just frustrated of like, why are they telling me my kid needs to go to special education, right? And you get with the right person, you can say, well, let me pull the records and see what's the history of this particular school and sending Black kids to special education. Nothing wrong with special education if we need it, right? But we are overdiagnosed for that, and it is a historical fact, right? And sometimes we just feel powerless of like, these jokers aren't even responding to me, and everyone can't just pick up and leave. But it's like being persistent about it is critical, because we know the parents who give us grief at districts, right? It's just like, respond, you know what I mean? Because if you don't respond, they're going to be up here. They're going to be at the school board meeting. You know what I mean? They're going to bug everybody. They're going to send emails to them. Go ahead and respond. And that's hard. Even if you can't be there in person, it's just writing and demanding answers, like, because the schools are here to serve us. We're taxpayers, right? We're paying both federally, locally, and state for our kids to have a right to education, for sure.
Awesome. Great. All right. So as we said before, at this time we have a really unique opportunity to reimagine what education looks like for Black students. So what are each one of your organizations doing, or what role are you all playing in the educational equity?
Yeah. We actually shifted last year. There was actually an organization called Stride Partnership that sunsetted, and Cradle to Career reemerged out of that sunset and then kind of reimagining collective impact. And I think for us, it was really building a foundation. So, you look across the continuum, which is the Cradle to Career continuum, having some clear priorities and strategies. So, we have a Parent Champions Network, and Christian Davis, who runs CPN, just joined our team in that particular capacity. We have a Champions Network. I believe in this idea. How do we rally our community, businesses, and organizations around this idea of being champions for kids, right? At the end of the day, we as a community have a collective responsibility to be champions for all of our kids, right? You get into policy and advocacy and then, equitable recovery. But I think I shared the data points at the beginning of our conversation. I think it all boils down to how do we get our young people, predominantly those who have been most impacted by these educational disparities, how do we get them kindergarten ready, graduating, and going to college, right? How do we successfully ensure that they can navigate that cradle to career continuum? And so for us, we had an opportunity to start from scratch, to come out with a clear vision, but come out with clear strategies, elevating what already exists. You'd be surprised of just unfortunately the silos that I've experienced, since being in the city. And so how do we break down those barriers and truly have this idea of our collective responsibility for our youth education? And so I'm excited to be able to, share space with Eddie and, other leaders in our community, not only to, really be vocal around racial equity and education for our Black and minority students, but more importantly, again, how do we as Cincinnati and the greater Cincinnati region all have this idea of being champions for kids? Because at the end of the day, it's our collective responsibility to be champions for kids, regardless of your social economic status. But we know that these disparities have impacted our Black and minority students. And so I'm excited to go into year 2 with a very clear focus, looking to build a team around some of these strategies that we've identified. But more importantly, how do we ensure the parents are part of the co-creation process? Because I think we all do ourselves a disservice that parents and families have to be part of the process and not after the process, right? So we can't come in, ask them for their input, and then go away as individual organizations, but they truly have to be at the table. And I do believe that we, Eddie and I, in our different capacities and working with a variety of leadership, we can then invite them to be at other tables that then can advocate to shift power based off of how they see fit, right? Not how we as the organization see fit, but truly have their voice at the table to shift power to better benefit their kids in their educational experience.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, for Kelly probably can tell you better than I could. The Urban League, it's just engaging and really, we're at a space of, we like to say, to borrow a phrase, of being pissed with purpose. So engaging and brave truth telling. So I say that you and Bruce will tell you, because we're a part of these circles that always talks about, community engagement. You got to engage community for you.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's like, we are community. Our kids are in Cincinnati public schools. They're in the surrounding neighborhood districts, parochial schools, private schools. These are our uncles, aunties, people we have grown up with. And even when I meet a Black students, I say, yeah, I'm from Chicago originally. Like, I don't know you, but I know you, right? So one, it's just like, we're a community, right? Using our capital as a civil rights, as a workforce organization. We've helped over 1 million Black folks in the Cincinnati metro region. So how do we use that to our advantage? So our education work is going to be it is housed currently at our Center for Social Justice. And that's this idea of you have a right to a good education, right? Not just a right to an equitable field, not just a right to equal funding, for your books, right? You have a right to a good education. And if we lead to that, what does that drive from a reform standpoint? I am so sick of hearing these statistics about how Black boys compare to white students when it comes to reading and math. Nobody ever talks about the damn Asian and white gap. It's very substantial, right? So challenging a lot of these dominant narratives, of like what is Black achievement and Black excellence, and then using our own bully pulpit. Everyone knows about the State of Black Cincinnati that we produce, but really lifting that up a level instead of just saying the data. Here are the institutional structures and racist practices that persist, that enables this data to stay around, right? Because we need a healthy city, and there is talent in our school system. There is so much talent, even in Cincinnati public schools. I've met some brilliant people in Cincinnati, right? They just need to be unleashed. They're shackled by this structure, right? This structure of politics. If you ask anybody that's involved in education, they're going to say the same thing. We all care about the best for our kids. They said the same thing when I was chief of staff. Until you start to get into the minutia about Bruce's questions about who has the power to change, right? We all agree on the outcome we want people to see, but who has the power to change policy and to say how we educate our kids? And that's what we got to take back. And then kind of two more quick things is that when we started to think about education in the scope of the Center for Social Justice, when you think about all of the organizations, whether Cincinnati or Dayton or across the country, a lot of them, they do engagement and mobilization, right? They do engagement. They tell the families what's happening. Here is the process. If you want to speak at a board meeting, here's what you need to do. They do mobilization of this is bad for your school, right? We need to vote against this because this will take away money from our teachers. And if you approve this, or this is going to be bad for us, you need to come down here and support our teachers. They mobilize them. What they don't do is empower them. We don't see a lot of that, of saying, here is the dollars to support you, right? I'm going to educate you radically about the process of what happens when you have social capital. And here's resources behind you. And I'm going to hold your hand side by side and actually empower you because you have the unimpeachable voice. That's what we don't have. We mistaken empowerment with engagement and mobilization, which happens all across the country. But until we actually put the power to the people, we won't see the transformational change that we need. And with that, we are starting a C4 at the Urban League over the next 6 months, hopefully, which I'm excited about, just for that purpose, to really put the power back into parents' hands. It shouldn't be a union's decision about what our education system should look about. It shouldn't be the business communities. It should be parents and students about how they reimagine education. And I think when you have a C4 in political capital, you can actually elect candidates that stand for your values and not in your respective camps.
Awesome. And then personally, within my role, I am soliciting parents. I want to talk to parents. I want to have one-on-one conversations. We're going to have larger group meetings to discuss what are those things that parents want to see done differently. What are schools doing right? What are districts doing right that parents want to see replicated in other schools and other districts? I know, Eddie, you had mentioned Evanston Academy. What's going on at Evanston Academy that we can replicate at other schools? Yeah. So definitely be in touch and make sure that you're advocating for those changes within your school and within your community. So I appreciate you both, Bruce and Eddie, for joining us tonight. This was a great conversation. There's some great comments in the comment section. I know that a lot of parents feel very motivated and excited about the work that we're all going to be doing. This will actually be the first of many forums that we're going to be having here at the Center for Social Justice about education. So be on the lookout for those posts and that information. And again, Eddie and Bruce, I thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Yeah, no, thank you again, Kelly. I'm glad to have you on board. And Eddie, as you and I first met, I think it was over the phone this time last year because I didn't move into August. Happy to, live in this space and create these ideas and strategies that'll benefit our, kids and families. And so, I look forward to continue to serve alongside you and others here in Cincinnati.
Yeah, I was excited when Bruce was coming here. It's a powerful brother. So we definitely need him in our community. So just looking forward to collaborating with all that you do. And Kelly, we've been just thrilled to have her on board. She hit the ground running and it's been nonstop. I'm not sure when she sleeps, but I appreciate it.
Yeah,
in the words of Nas, you don't need to sleep. You know, Nas said he can sleep when you're dead.
And look, my dad used to tell me you can sleep when you're dead. So
Right.
while you're on this earth, you got to put in that work. So
got to put in that work.
Don't tell Ashley that. She literally doesn't sleep.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But no, this has been great, and look forward to this continued journey as we serve our youth and families.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you guys. Have a great evening.
Yep. All right. See you guys.